When people talk about the Buddha today, they almost always recall a beautiful, complete story. The great king receives a prophecy. His newborn son will become either the ruler of the world or a great spiritual teacher. The father is afraid of the second fate and decides to deceive reality itself. He surrounds the child with luxury, hides old age, illness, and death. The young man lives among music, gardens, and eternal youth, until one day he goes out of the gate and is confronted with the truth. A decrepit old man, an emaciated sick man, a funeral procession, and a calm hermit. Shocked, he leaves the palace to find a way out of his suffering. This story is so well known that it is perceived as an undoubted biography. It is retold by books, films, and even popular scientific works. However, in the early Buddhist texts, the Buddha himself tells about his life in a different way. Moreover, the story of the four meetings is indeed present in ancient writings, but it does not refer to Gautama, but to another Buddha of the distant past, who, according to tradition, lived in a previous era of the world. Over time, this vivid image was transferred to the historical Buddha, and the legend replaced the simpler but plausible narrative. If we remove the late decorations, we see a different picture. Northern India at that time consisted not of empires, but of many small city-states and unions of clans. They competed, formed alliances, and sometimes fought. The Shakya tribe, to which the future Buddha belonged, was one of these associations. Their center, Kapilavastu, was a small town, rather a fortified settlement. Archaeology shows that it could not have been the capital of a huge kingdom. The Shakyas were ruled by a council of nobles, and Siddhartha's father, Suddhodana, was the head of the family, respected, wealthy, but not an absolute monarch. Therefore, the childhood of the future Buddha was not a palace isolation, but life in the house of a noble kshatriya, a military aristocracy. This meant responsibility, participation in the affairs of the family, training in management, and, if necessary, war. He was not isolated from the world. He saw fields, labor, aging people, disease, and death. Moreover, death came to him very early. His mother died a week after giving birth. He was raised by his aunt, his father's second wife. This alone refutes the idea that he first learned about death in adulthood. He watched old age every day. His father was a man of mature years. There is also an episode from childhood, a plowing festival, when the head of the family himself works in the field next to the farmers. The boy is sitting in the shade of a tree and notices how the birds are pecking at the worms raised by the plow. Life feeds on life. Later, the tradition saw in this the first glimmer of understanding of the universal dissatisfaction of existence. Later texts describe the Buddha as a man with 32 superhuman attributes: golden skin, long arms, a special protrusion on top of his head, and footmarks. These signs were considered the marks of a great man in ancient India and were borrowed from the Brahmin culture of divination. However, the early stories show something else. When the rulers came to the community, they could not distinguish the Buddha from other monks. The Brahmins often referred to him as a shaven-headed ascetic. Wandering hermits took him for an ordinary wanderer. All this indicates that he looked like an ordinary person, without any external, miraculous differences. Later tradition probably endowed him with special features in order to speak to the religious consciousness of that era in a language he understood. Siddhartha's youth was spent within the framework of the usual life of the nobility. He studied, competed, got married. His son Rahula was born. But even then he was experiencing an internal crisis. He saw that wealth and position did not save him from aging, illness, and death. This understanding did not arise overnight. It matured gradually. When he was 29 years old, he decided to leave. Contrary to popular legend, he did not escape at night. He announced his intention to his family. His parents were crying, but he cut his hair, put on the clothes of a wanderer, and left the house. This step was not something incredible for that era. In India, there was a movement of Shramans, people who left home to seek the truth. It was considered right to continue the family line first, and then enter the spiritual life. Siddhartha did just that. At first, he studied with famous meditation mentors, Alara Kalama and Udaka Ramaputta. He had reached their highest states, but he understood they do not give final release. Then he turned to extreme austerities. He almost stopped eating, brought his body to exhaustion, and was on the verge of death. He later said that he could touch his spine through his stomach. But even this did not bring the goal. Disappointed by the extremes, he recalled the calm state of concentration he experienced as a child. He realized that the path should be a middle one, not self-indulgence and not the destruction of the body. He sat down under a tree by the river and focused his attention on the very process of suffering. There came an understanding. How desires arise, how they bind the mind, and how they cease. He saw the relationship between actions and consequences, past and future states, and formulated what he would later call the Four Noble Truths. He was 35 years old. After his awakening, he did not declare himself a god. He began to teach. His first students were former ascetic comrades. Then people from all walks of life began to come to him. Later, relatives joined the community: a son, a brother, cousins, a foster mother, and a wife. He founded both men's and women's communities, which was unusual for that time. He returned to his hometown and communicated with the rulers. He was respected not for his background, but for his clarity of speech and calmness. He argued that a person is determined not by birth, but by actions and understanding. Liberation is achieved not by sacrifices, rituals, or blessings, but by direct knowledge of the nature of the experience. Over time, myths arose that magnified his image. This is natural. It is easier for people to worship a Superman than to follow the example of a human. But the early tradition retains a different emphasis. The Buddha is not a creature from a legend, but a man who consistently explored the experience to the end. And that's exactly the value of his story. It's not about miracles, it's about understanding. Not about divine intervention, but about attention. He showed that the path does not begin with faith, but with observation. Everything changes. An attempt to keep the changeable brings dissatisfaction, and liberation is possible through understanding the reasons. Therefore, when we remove the late decorations, his life does not become less significant. On the contrary, it's getting closer. This is not an unattainable hero, but a man who lived among responsibilities, family, doubts, and searches, and found the answer. The story of the Buddha is not a fairy tale about how someone became a god. This is a story about how a person fully understood human life and showed the way to those who are willing to look just as carefully.